What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, I was handed an award on stage, the kind of recognition you do not get every year, and as the camera landed on me, I smiled, took a breath, and said one sentence that made my entire family blow up my phone by dinner. The words were simple: if you are not proud enough to show up, do not bother calling. I had rehearsed my acceptance speech a dozen times in my head, thanking mentors, colleagues, and even patients who had stuck with me through the hardest years. But when I looked out and saw that empty row that had been reserved for my family, something shifted in me. It was not anger at that moment, more like a realization that silence was no longer an option. You have to understand, I had reminded them about this day so many times it became embarrassing. I had printed the date on the holiday cards, mentioned it at Thanksgiving, even texted them reminders in the group chat where everything else was about my brother Evan's business. Everyone knew I was receiving this hospital leadership award, the kind that only comes after endless night shifts and a mountain of paperwork that most people never want to touch. My colleagues had rearranged their shifts to be there. The hospital staff had bought a cake, and even the union rep showed up. Yet when I walked out, the entire row with our name cards was empty. Not a single person from my family. At first, I thought maybe traffic had delayed them. I checked my phone discreetly and saw nothing except a message from Aunt Carol the day before saying she hoped everything went smoothly. That phrasing hit me like a slap because it sounded like someone who had already written herself out of attendance. While other honorees waved at their parents, children, or spouses, I was looking at blank chairs. That was the moment I knew I could not just smile and pretend. I want to be clear, my family is not evil. They are ordinary, which is sometimes worse. Ordinary families can guilt you into thinking their constant absence is your fault, or that if you just stop making things about yourself, everyone will be happy. For years, I had been the fixer. When the phone bill was overdue, I paid it. When Evan needed a loan to cover the catering deposit, I sent the money. When Mom's car broke down, I was the one who rented something for her. All of it went on my back while I kept my own head above water with side shifts and delayed vacations. The deal was always that family takes care of each other, but in practice it meant I did the work and everyone else found reasons why they could not. So when my name was called and the applause filled the room, I felt something rare: permission. The microphone was in my hand, the camera red light was on, and this was the first time I had the stage with no one standing in front of me telling me to tone it down. That sentence came out steady and calm: if you are not proud enough to show up, do not bother calling. I followed it with a quick thank you to my unit and the staff who had supported me, then I stepped back and returned to my seat. By the time I sat down, my phone buzzed. At first, I thought maybe one of them was running in late and wanted directions, but no, it was a flood of messages from coworkers sharing screenshots of the live stream comments. People were already quoting my line, and the chat was filling with hearts, applause emojis, and things like "preach" and "she said what needed to be said." It was surreal because strangers were celebrating my boundary while my own family had not even acknowledged I was on stage. When the ceremony ended, I went to the small reception area. Other honorees were taking group photos with their families. One woman even pulled me aside and said, "I wish I had your courage." My parents skipped mine last year too, and I just smiled through it. That felt like the validation I did not even know I needed. For once, I was not the crazy or dramatic one. I was just honest. Later that night, I opened my phone again, and that group chat that had been silent all day was still silent. No congratulations, no explanation, nothing. Instead, I had a string of missed calls from Aunt Carol, who finally got through by using her office landline. Her voice was hushed, like she was delivering bad news. "Honey, you are trending inside the family chat. Your mom says you embarrassed them on purpose." Embarrassed them? I thought I had just described reality. They had chosen not to be there, and I had acknowledged it. But Carol whispered like I had committed some scandal. She told me Mom was furious and Dad was saying, "Let us not make this bigger than it is." That was his classic move, the same one he used every time Evan ran short on money or Mom said something sharp. Sweep it under the rug, move on, pretend it never happened. But here is the thing, I did not want to pretend anymore. I had spent too many years pretending everything was fine while I quietly paid their bills. So instead of crying or apologizing, I opened the carrier app on my phone, scrolled down to Manage Lines, and canceled every extra line that was not mine. Effective at the end of the billing cycle. Then I drafted a short email. Effective this month, I will only pay for my line. Please arrange new accounts for your numbers by the 15th. Love, Nora. It was not revenge in the dramatic sense. It was just a reset. A boundary written in black and white with a timestamp. The truth is, I did not feel angry after sending it. I felt calm, almost relieved. For the first time, I was treating myself with the same seriousness I had always reserved for them. I put the phone down, poured myself some water, and thought, if this is what they call embarrassing, maybe I should have done it years ago. What I did not expect was that the very next morning, a new problem would land in my inbox. A problem with my name on it, one I had not signed up for, and one that made it clear just how far my family had gone while I was busy covering their tracks. The morning after the ceremony felt like the kind of morning when you want to keep your phone face down and your mouth shut, not because you're afraid of what people might say, but because you already know the script they will use and you are tired of hearing it. So I brewed coffee, sat at my small kitchen table, and pressed play on the voicemails one by one, letting the pattern announce itself without me feeding it excuses. Mom started with that soft, careful tone she reserves for moments when she wants to sound reasonable while drawing blood, telling me they could not make it because there was an obligation for my brother's launch dinner, and that family is complicated and I should not turn something joyful into a problem, which, if you have ever been the designated grown-up in a family that loves a spectacle, you already know is code for we chose him, but please do not say that out loud. Dad's message was the same as always, asking me not to make a scene and to remember that we can work things out as a family. Which is rich given that the only time he ever wants to work things out is after someone else has broken something and I am standing there with the broom. So I listened, breathed, and then moved to Evan's text where he wrote that I should stop being dramatic because his event had been scheduled first, as if the calendar I sent them in November had been a fairy tale and the printed invitations living on their fridge were props in a show that did not really run. I pulled my reminders and counted them out loud just for myself. The first message around Thanksgiving, the second in early January with the exact time and the live stream link. The third after New Year's when I told them the row was reserved and all they had to do was sit down and clap, and I felt the old heat build in my chest, not from rage, but from the knowledge that I had taught them I would always be the one to carry the weight, and they had learned the lesson very well. Colleagues were kinder than I expected, sending photos I had missed and little notes that sounded like relief, and one friend from the night shift wrote that she wished someone had said what I said when her dad skipped her nursing pinning, which reminded me that the shame is never in the truth itself, it is in the long habit of hiding it. So when the hospital PR person called to ask whether I wanted the clip removed from the feed, I thanked her for checking and told her to leave it up because I was done cleaning up other people's choices. Aunt Carol, with that busy whisper that makes everything sound like a secret meeting, told me the family group chat had turned into a tribunal where people were debating whether I had humiliated the whole bloodline on purpose. And I said very calmly that I had described an empty row and thanked the people who showed up, and if the shoe pinched, maybe it belonged to the right foot, and Carol laughed in that guilty way that says she agrees, but cannot afford to say it in public, then asked if I could text something to calm Mom down before Sunday, because the church ladies were apparently already asking questions. Calming Mom down has been the unpaid job I never officially accepted, and as I sat there with the coffee going lukewarm, I decided to do something I should have done years ago, which is replace feelings with records. So I opened a private folder and dropped in screenshots of the invitations, the calendar reminders, and the texts with the times and the live stream link. Nothing dramatic and nothing public, just a tidy little archive labeled record. Because if there is any lesson life has carved into me, it is that memory is a slippery thing and paper holds the line. Then, while the folder was syncing, I wrote a message for the family that used plain language and no emotional bait, explaining that going forward I would honor commitments that are mutually honored. That previous loans would move onto a written schedule with payment dates spelled out in full words, that missed payments would shift the debt to small claims without ceremony, and that I was available to discuss details in writing because I was done with midnight phone calls and disappearing agreements, and before my hands could second-guess me, I tapped send and turned off read receipts so I would not sit there watching the little dots play coy. For a few minutes, the house was quiet in that way that makes you think you have actually changed something deep in the foundation, and I let myself enjoy the stillness while the dryer hummed and the living room looked like a place where an adult lives. But I knew silence in my family is rarely a sign of peace and often a sign of regrouping, so I put on my badge lanyard, grabbed my tote, and headed to the hospital, where the night shift team had left me a paper card with a dozen messy signatures and a joke about putting my sentence on the break room wall next to the hand-washing chart, which made me laugh harder than I meant to because sometimes humor lands exactly where the bruise sits. Around lunchtime, after a patient family meeting that did not go off the rails for once, I checked my phone and found a cluster of texts from unknown numbers that turned out to be church friends asking if I was okay and also if the live stream was recorded, followed by a fresh voicemail from Mom saying she wanted to talk woman to woman about how I could repair the damage before Sunday. Not a word about the award, just damage control and the implication that my mouth was the enemy and not. There are empty seats, and I felt the smallest click inside me, like a lock turning, because I finally understood that some people will only see fire in your honesty if their furniture is made of dry lies. I typed a response that was measured and short by my standards, but still complete, telling her I loved her, that I had told the truth, that I was open to talking after I received an actual apology for not showing up, and that I would prefer we do it in writing for clarity. Then I put the phone down and went to chart notes, and for the first time in a long time my hands did not shake. When I came back from rounds, there was an email sitting at the top of my inbox with a subject line that made my stomach do a slow, heavy roll. Something like, "Welcome, your vendor credit has been approved." And the body of the message congratulated me by name on opening an account I had never applied for with a restaurant supply company I recognized only because Evan had talked about their catalog when he was bragging about the catering launch, and right there, in the first paragraph, was a customer number tied to my name and a signature on file that did not belong to me. When I opened that email, the words blurred together in the way they do when your brain knows something is wrong before your body even catches up, and I had to read it 3 times before I understood that my name, my address, and my social security number had been used to open a vendor credit account for a restaurant supply company I had never contacted in my life, which meant that somewhere between my ceremony and my morning coffee, a line I had hoped they would never cross had already been trampled. The message congratulated me on being approved for a credit line, welcomed me as a valued partner, and gave instructions on how to order wholesale items like commercial ovens, freezer units, and crates of food supplies, all billed to my account, which made no sense until I remembered how Evan had bragged a few weeks ago about finally getting his catering company moving, except back then he had admitted banks were hesitant and vendors were slow to trust new businesses, so the puzzle clicked together with sickening speed. I called the company directly, trying to keep my voice level, and asked for a copy of the application that had been filed under my name, and the woman on the line hesitated at first, but then said she could email me the file if I verified some information. Which I did, because of course my personal details were already in their system, and within 5 minutes a PDF landed in my inbox with a scrawled signature that was supposed to be mine, but looked more like a rushed imitation done by someone who thought no one would ever check. The business address listed on the form was Evan's new storefront, the contact number was my mother's cell, and the email address tied to the account was a generic Gmail that I had never used. So every piece of evidence pointed back to the people who had not shown up for me the night before. I sat there staring at the screen, thinking about how many years I had let them use my name in smaller ways, like adding lines to my phone plan or putting groceries on my card with the promise of, "We will pay you back." And how each time I had swallowed the discomfort because it seemed easier than saying no, but now here was my credit tied to thousands of dollars in potential debt, and if they missed a payment, it would not be Evan's reputation on the line, it would be mine. The thought made me sick in a deep, steady way, not explosive anger, but the heavy realization that enabling them had not protected me, it had trained them to believe my boundaries were imaginary. I called Evan, and he answered on the third ring with the breezy tone he always used when he thought he could charm his way out of trouble, and I said without any introduction, "You used my name to open a vendor account." And he laughed lightly like I had accused him of something trivial, replying, "Come on, it's just to get started. It will all roll over to the business once we have cash flow. Don't make it a big deal." I repeated myself, slower, "You forged my signature," and there was a pause before he said, "Don't act like this is the end of the world. You know we are family. You know it's all temporary. You know we will take care of it." His words landed like recycled excuses, thin and practiced, and I realized he had no plan to fix it because in his mind it was already fixed, since I was on the hook and he could move forward without consequence. I ended the call without arguing because there was nothing left to argue about, and instead I called my mother, who at first denied knowing anything, then admitted she had given Evan my social security number because he had sworn this was just paperwork formality, and when I reminded her that using someone's information without permission is fraud, she sighed heavily and said, "We were going to tell you after the launch, when things had calmed down." That sentence, the casual "after the launch," cut deeper than the forged signature because it showed how little they thought my trust was worth, just another tool to be borrowed and returned dented, maybe, if it was convenient. So I did what I should have done years ago. I called the vendor back, explained the situation in measured detail, and asked to file a formal dispute, and the representative, who had probably heard versions of this before, walked me through the steps, sending me a compliance email to confirm my claim and freeze the account. Then I contacted the credit bureaus and placed a fraud alert on my file, because I knew that if Evan had done it once, he could do it again, and at least this way I would get notified before the damage went further. That afternoon, I dug through my old files until I found the notarized promissory note Evan had signed 2 years ago when he borrowed money for another once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the one he swore he would repay by last spring. And I remembered how I had believed him because it felt cruel not to, and how he had never even mentioned it again. Holding that piece of paper now, stamped and sealed, I realized it was not just about repayment anymore. It was about showing myself that I had been telling the truth all along, that I was not dramatic, not ungrateful, not selfish, but simply someone who had been taken advantage of. By the time I returned to the hospital the next morning, I had already drafted a short email to Evan with a clear deadline spelled out in full words, telling him that the fraudulent account must be closed by the end of the week and that all further financial interactions would require written agreements witnessed by a third party, and I CC'd my mother so she could not claim ignorance later. I sent it, saved a copy in my new record folder, and then turned my phone to silent because I knew the responses would be nothing but noise. It was almost noon when my father showed up at my apartment unannounced, standing in the doorway with his hands shoved into his jacket pockets like he wanted to look smaller than he was, and he said, "Your aunt tells me you are threatening to sue your own family. Is that really what you want your grandmother's legacy to be?" He leaned hard on that word, legacy, as if saying it loud enough could erase forged signatures and broken promises, and I stood there, tired from another double shift, staring at the man who had taught me to be quiet for the sake of peace and thought, maybe for the first time in my life, that his version of peace had always come at my expense. When my father stood in my doorway asking whether I really wanted my grandmother's legacy to be a courtroom story instead of a family dinner, I felt the old reflex to apologize rise up like a bad habit. And I caught it with both hands because I finally understood that the word legacy had been used in our family as a kind of velvet rope to pull women back into line, so I asked him to sit. I brought out the file box my grandmother taught me to keep with labeled envelopes and dates written across the flaps in thick pen, and I laid them on the coffee table the way a nurse lays out instruments before a procedure, not to show off and not to shame, but to make it impossible to pretend the wound is not there. I told him that when Grandma used to say write it down and back it up, she did not mean keep score to hurt people. She meant protect the truth so that when someone starts doubting your memory you still have a spine made of paper. And I slid the first envelope across the table, the one with the notarized promissory note Evan signed 2 years ago when I covered his deposit, the second envelope with the bank statements that showed my temporary transfers during the winter when he said clients were slow, and the third with screenshots of my calendar reminders for the ceremony, and I reminded him gently that legacy without accountability is just a family myth that lets the loudest person win, which might feel like peace in the moment, but always turns into a bill someone else has to pay. He started to say the words I have heard all my life, that we could work this out in the family, that airing things makes them worse, that church people talk, and I told him calmly that the church ladies had already called me to ask if I was okay, that I had not posted anything online or asked anyone to take sides, and that the only thing making this loud was the silence they used when it was time to show up for me, because an empty row in a public room speaks louder than any speech. And when he tried the softer approach, telling me my mother had cried after watching the clip because she felt judged, I answered that I had not judged anyone. I had described the truth in one sentence, and if the truth felt like judgment, that was an internal problem they needed to name. We sat there while he read the promissory note, and I watched him trace the stamped seal with his thumb like he was trying to rub it off, and I did not gloat, and I did not push. I just explained that from this point on we would be doing business like adults do business, with written agreements and dates and consequences, because the experiment of unspoken expectations had failed for a decade, and I was done donating my sanity to a system that only worked for the people who drained it. And to his credit, he did not explode. He just looked tired and said he would talk to Evan and see what could be done. That afternoon I drove to the credit union, closed the old joint account I had almost forgotten existed, the one I had opened back when Evan swore he needed a cosigner for exactly 6 months. And I sat across from a teller who did not know my family and therefore did not need the backstory to treat me like someone who deserved clean lines and final answers. And I signed the closure forms with a steady hand because it felt like sealing a door that had let in too much cold for too many winters. And on the way home I stopped by the notary office my unit uses for employee documents and had a short release letter notarized stating that I would not co-sign or extend credit to anyone going forward, not as a threat and not as a performance, but as a boundary that would survive the next round of pleading voices. Back at the apartment, I opened the savings account labeled Grandma Fund, the one I had quietly built for Evan's kids because it felt like the right thing to do when their parents were always one missed invoice away from a crisis. And I felt that uncomfortable twist in my stomach because I truly love those kids and I do not want to punish them for their father's choices. Yet I could also hear my grandmother's actual voice in my head, not the version my parents like to quote, but the one she used when she taught me to balance a checkbook on her kitchen table, saying that money should follow values or it will fund the very thing that hurts you. So I moved the balance into a new account under the hospital foundation and filled out forms to create a small scholarship for daughters of night shift workers who are studying to become nurses. And I named it for my grandmother because she did the hard work without applause, and I wrote a quiet email to my family explaining that the fund was still in her name and still for family, only now family meant the girls we say we care about when we light a candle on holidays and then forget the next morning. Almost immediately my phone rang with my mother's number, and I let it go to voicemail because I wanted the message in writing, and she did not disappoint, leaving a long lecture about how I had humiliated them by announcing a scholarship when the community already thought I had made a spectacle of myself on stage. And I laughed out loud in my empty living room because the mental gymnastics required to call a scholarship a spectacle would have qualified her for an Olympic team if gossip were a sport, and I replied with a short text saying that I would be excited to see them at the announcement if they chose to attend, since the hospital had invited me to introduce it at the staff town hall next week, and that I would welcome their support in honoring Grandma the way she actually lived. In the middle of drafting that text, an email from the vendor arrived, crisp and efficient, informing me that the disputed account tied to my name had been closed and that no charges remained. And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding until my chest loosened. But the relief lasted only a minute because the final line of the message mentioned that the initial deposit which triggered the account verification had come from a joint account later identified as shared between me and Evan, an account I had just closed that morning, which meant the forgery did not just lean on my name, it sat directly on a platform I had helped build years ago when I thought being a good sister meant being an unpaid safety net. I stared at that sentence and felt the ground tilt just a little, not enough to knock me down, but enough to make me widen my stance, and I thought about how many times I had told myself that the next boundary would be the last one I ever needed. Only to learn that people who benefit from your softness are expert rock climbers on the cliffs of your patience, and I knew exactly what I had to do next, not because it would be pretty and not because it would win the family popularity contest, but because the only way out of a maze built from your own favors is to stop being the architect and start locking the doors behind you as you leave. The week after the vendor email felt like one long test of whether I would keep slipping back into the role they had written for me or whether I would finally close the script and pick up a pen of my own, because every call, every message, and every sideways comment from relatives carried the same theme, that I had gone too far, that family business should stay quiet, that grandma would not have wanted things to get ugly, and yet beneath all of those phrases lived the real request, which was that I keep carrying the weight so they could keep pretending nothing had broken. I had spent years letting guilt disguise itself as love, but by the end of that week I was no longer interested in guilt, only in clarity, so I sat down with a legal pad and made a list of everything still tied to my name. And when I finished I saw that nearly every loose end could be cut without hurting me. The first move was practical and cold. I updated my life insurance and retirement beneficiaries to the scholarship fund instead of family, because I did not want to die someday knowing that the money meant to honor me would be siphoned off into Evan's endless startups or Mom's quiet cover-ups, and I walked into HR, filled out the forms, and left with copies that felt like shields. Because whatever storms might come next, at least my legacy would not be another family story about how Nora gave. And gave until nothing was left. The second move was equally deliberate. I called the bank where the old joint account had lived, confirmed it was closed, and requested written proof so that no one could ever again claim that I had offered silent permission. Because silence had always been their favorite loophole. When I finally picked up my mother's call, she started with a whisper, almost conspiratorial, telling me the church ladies were buzzing, that she had been cornered after service and asked whether it was true I had cut off the phones and pulled the money. And she wanted me to fix it by showing up to Sunday dinner with a smile so everyone could see that we were still united. I listened carefully and then asked her one simple question. Why was it easier for you to tell strangers I was dramatic than it was to sit in a row for me for 1 hour? She went silent for a long moment before sighing and saying that I had blindsided them, and I replied without raising my voice that I had sent reminders, that I had begged them not to make me invisible, that the only blindsiding done that week had been by them, and that if she wanted the whispers to stop, she could tell the truth for once instead of asking me to edit myself back into silence. Her next line was soft but sharp, accusing me of humiliating the family twice now, first on stage and then with the scholarship, and I answered that humiliation only grows in the soil of lies, and that if showing the truth was embarrassing, maybe it was time they asked why. She tried again with guilt, telling me that Evan's business might collapse if I did not give him a chance, and I asked whether he had signed the repayment schedule I sent, knowing the answer already, and when she stammered and admitted he had not, I told her calmly that then the collapse would be his choice, not mine. The conversation ended with her saying, "I hope you can live with yourself," and I told her, for the first time in years, I actually can. The real moment of shift came not with them but with my colleagues, because when the hospital asked me to present the scholarship at the town hall, I stood in front of a room filled with staff who had worked beside me through endless night shifts, and I explained that the fund was for daughters of night workers who often get overlooked, and I finished with one simple line, "Only 3 words changed my life this week, no more enabling." The applause that followed was not the loud, chaotic kind that families use to drown out uncomfortable truths. It was steady and respectful, the kind of sound that tells you people understand not just what you said, but why it mattered. And I realized that the legacy I wanted was already being written in that moment, with people who actually showed up when it counted. Later that night, I sent one final message to the family group thread, attaching 2 files. The first was an audio clip from years ago, a saved voicemail from Grandma herself, where she told me in her own voice that I could love people and still tell them no, that saying no does not mean you stopped caring, it just means you know your limits. The second file was the repayment schedule signed by Dad, who, after sitting with my envelopes and notes, had written his name carefully on the dotted line, acknowledging the debt for the first time in writing. Evan had not signed, of course, and maybe he never will, but that part no longer keeps me awake at night, because the point was never to force him into decency. The point was to stop confusing his shortcuts with my responsibility. I do not know what will happen with them in the long run, whether holidays will be cold or whether someday they will soften and actually show up without strings, but I do know this. I have stopped paying the cover charge just to sit at a table where my presence was never respected, and I have started building tables of my own, where people understand that loyalty is measured by actions, not by last names. And when I think back to the ceremony, to that empty row that hurt so much in the moment, I no longer see it as a wound. I see it as the first honest photograph of my life, proof of what had always been true, that sometimes family will not clap for you. But strangers will, colleagues will, and most importantly, you will clap for yourself when you finally refuse to stay invisible. So when people ask me if I regret saying that line on stage, if I regret sending the emails and closing the accounts and redirecting the fund, I tell them no, because every step brought me closer to a truth I had hidden even from myself. That love without respect is just dependency dressed up as tradition, and I am no longer interested in being a tradition that sacrifices itself quietly. The phone still rings, the texts still come, and the stories still twist, but I am not afraid of any of it now, because the most important call I answered was the one inside my own head, the one that said, "Stop explaining, stop apologizing, stop waiting for them to show up. They already told you who they are. The only question left is, who are you going to be?" And for the first time in my life, I can answer without hesitation. I am the woman who walked off that stage with an empty row behind her and finally understood her own worth.